Good evening, everyone. Hi, and welcome back to Virtual Salons Discourses on Black Italia. We are very glad to be back with two more episodes. And I am Angelica Pesarini. I'm a professor at NYU Florence, teaching a course called Black Italia. And as usual, I have my co-host here with me, Candice Whitney. Hi, Candice.
Hi, Angelica. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for our speakers and Casa Italiana.
So today's topic is quite fascinating, but also very relevant at the moment. In fact, the title of this episode is Reimagining the Archives and Centering Black Histories. So we have been thinking how archives and museums have histories of perpetuating systemic racism and colonial logics. So we are wondering how are curators, artists, and activists reimagining and rebuilding the archives in order to center the Black experiences and Black histories in Italy? What are the processes to do that, and how these intersect with community building and grassroots movements? And so today we have a fantastic roundtable, and our speakers will explore the role of practitioners and scholars, but also how artists address these issues of flattening the experiences and works of people of the African diaspora in the archives, exhibitions, and museums. So, Candice, would you like to introduce our guests for today?
Absolutely. We have a really exciting group of panelists today. So I'll start with Benjamina Fuadazzi, who is a Ghanaian Italian researcher with an interest in West African cultures, especially Akan and Yoruba. In her work, she explores agency, representation, and self-determination. Her current research deals with the impact of the missionary presence in the 19th century Abeokuta in southwestern Nigeria. She is a former graduate attaché at the British Institute in Eastern Africa and currently a collections assistant in anthropology at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. We also have Justin Randolph Thompson, who is a new media artist, cultural facilitator, and educator from the United States. Living between Italy and the US since 1999, Thompson is a co-founder and director of Black History Month Florence, a multifaceted exploration of African and African diasporic cultures in Italy since 2016. Thompson is a recipient of numerous awards and grants, such as the Louise Comfort Tiffany and two Foundation for Contemporary Art Emergency grants. His life and work seek to deepen the discussions around sociocultural stratification and hierarchical organization by employing fleeting temporary communities as monuments and fostering projects that connect academic discourse, social activism, and DIY or do-it-yourself networking strategies in gatherings and sharing and gestures of collectivity. We also have Simone Frangi, who is a researcher, writer, and curator operating at the intersection between critical thinking, curatorial research, and educational practices. He holds a French-Italian PhD in aesthetics and theory of art. He currently co-directs Live Works Free School of Performance in Trento and A Natural Oases, a transnational curatorial program focused on small states and micro-territories in the Mediterranean. He's currently a lecturer on the theory of contemporary arts at the Fine Arts and Design Academy in Grenoble, France, where he co-founded the workshop and residency-based research unit Practices of Hospitality. In 2016, he was one of the 10 curators of the Quadriennale of Rome with the project Orestiada Italiana, and in 2018, he was the guest curator of the Museum, where he presented the program Soma Technics, Transparent Travelers, and Obscure Nobodies. He's currently the senior curator of School of Waters, 19th edition of Mediterranea, the biennial of young artists from Europe and the Mediterranean. And lastly, with this exciting panel that we have today, we have Theophilus Imani, who's been trained in medicine and surgery at the University of Pavia in Italy. Alongside his medical education, he has cultivated a critical interest in African diaspora studies and visual cultural studies, with a special focus on contemporary African and African diaspora art. His attention to Black visual arts has produced Eki Accordi, or Echoes and Agreements, a digital series that has been the subject of academic interest. So we have this really exciting panel with just a breadth of experience that we're really looking forward to just digging deeper into, just discussing about how activists and scholars are reimagining the archives and just centering experiences of Blackness. So I'm going to start with the first question. So my first question for you all is, in light of your work, do you think that curators, artists, and activists are reimagining and rebuilding the archives to center Black experiences in Italy? So for this question, I'd really like you to just share a bit more about your work by introducing it, and then just share some examples in the audience to help support your answer for if you think curators, artists, and activists are reimagining and rebuilding the archives to center Black experiences in Italy. Justin, do you mind getting us started?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and for the introduction. I think that, to put forward the sort of question of reimagining, rebuilding, and sort of rethinking, and then to also put forth the thought of curators, artists, and activists together. For me, it's a sort of my work rests at an intersection between all of those things. And so it's actually reflections on what it means to sort of rebuild and to rethink and to recover are really central to all of the work that I carry forth. And I tend to work across a network of activists, artists, and curators. So in a certain sense, I can definitely acknowledge that this is something that is taking place, that there are people that are doing this work. I think, the platform that was born through Black History Month Florence, which has then morphed in a million different ways into various sectors of research dedicated to archives through the project Black Archive Alliance, which is a research project dedicated to looking at archival histories in the context of Italy, and really thinking about all of these different periods of history and thinking about Black African presence in the Italian territory going back through antiquity. That's a project that has allowed us to come in contact with a number of researchers, scholars, to sort of recover and bring to the surface a number of thinkers who have been doing this work for a long time, but also to sort of bring students in contact with archives, to render archives a little bit more accessible, to reimagine archives by connecting historic sites that we know of and we think of through the language of archives with more personal and private collections that may not be deemed such. And so it's been a really incredible space for me to sort of bring together and to meet with curators, artists, and activists, and to allow that project to sort of overlap with all of the other projects that Black History Month has been advancing that are dedicated to art, that are dedicated to research in different ways. And so in that process, I've had the opportunity to work really directly with a number of people who are also right here in this group, and to sort of discuss the role of, carrying these works forward. I think, in this current moment, one of the things that we can say is that in the past year, the words archive, colonial history, and Blackness have been, really extremely present across institutions. And I think that the real question that I have in relation to this is, when we talk about rebuilding archives to center Black experiences, to really think about the difference between centering and acknowledging. And I think that in the context of Italy, really what it's hard to sort of move into a space of really being able to center something if we have difficulty acknowledging it. And in my experience in this context, we're still in this phase of just the really basic acknowledgement. And that's something that I'm sure will become unpacked in this conversation today, but let's say that it's a starting point. So again, to sort of really create that distinction and that difference between what it means to simply acknowledge that there were, Black people in this territory in Roman times. To simply acknowledge that as a straightforward fact is already sort of a struggle. And so then to move from that into really centering and thinking about what it means to actually place that at the center of discourse, I think it's still a road that's ahead.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Justin. And yes, I agree that we will unpack a bit further just the difference between acknowledgement and centering. And as you were speaking, you reminded me of just some of the work that Black History Month Florence has done, such as being present with the Uffizi, and also just the great work of involving students and creating just this legacy, also just public arts through the Black History Month Florence work. I'd like to pass it off to Simone, Benjamina, Theophilus. If either one of you three could share more just about introduce your work, and if you could also share if you think that, do you think that curators, artists, and activists are reimagining and rebuilding the archives to center Black experiences in Italy?
Thank you so much for this space. So as you said, my background in terms of the work I do is very much outside of Italy. And so it actually affords me an opportunity to also see sort of the output that comes out of Italy. And yes, Justin and Black History Month Florence, they're doing incredible work. I think if we are looking at sort of institutions and how curators situate themselves in institutions, I don't think there is a centering that's happening. And even acknowledgement is sort of, it's hard to come by, is actually just sort of the past couple of years that I'm actually seeing in terms of the sort of looking from outside. I'm seeing this sort of acknowledgement happening. And I think, and perhaps we will come back to this reflection later, but, it is difficult for institutions that were built and are rooted in colonial legacies to sort of untangle that in a way that is effective if it's not if communities are not being sort of brought in. And so I'm so grateful for the work that independent artists are doing, Black independent artists are doing in Italy. And I think institutions should look at themselves and look at how they can actually follow suit. So I don't think it's happening in institutions to the scale that would be impactful.
Thank you, Benjamina. Yes, I agree with your reflection about having communities being brought in to just help with that untangling and deconstructing. That's really an important step for the impact of the work to continue to be sustainable. Simone, Theophilus, can either one of you just share more about your work, as well as if you can just share if you do you think that artists, curators, and activists are reimagining the archives?
Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and also to share the floor today with friends and people that are actually contributing to this very deep conversation in Italy in this moment. So I'm really grateful being here with them as well. Actually, it's a very important question, the ones that you are asking as a starting point to us. And I would say that it's pretty much relevant also for my experience into research and curating. And especially because I'm talking for very specific positions, which is the position of a white Italian, working with institutions and working with also artists and activists and independent experiences. And actually, I would say that for me, the question would be more also which artists are and which curators and which institutions are recentering the Black experience in Italy, because I would say that as Benjamina was pointing out, independent initiatives in Italy are doing the work and are especially doing also the work in pointing out how racism is not only cultural, but it's pretty much structural and institutional, and actually pointing out also how veiled racism is sneaking in a lot of our experiences, both politically and culturally speaking. So I would say that from my side, the most important consequence of this question is how actually this action of recentering Black experience in Italy, which has been drastically whitewashed as a nation, has to go hand in hand with the very intense work of critical whiteness. And so I would say that this is a pretty much, it's not a consequence, but maybe the very first step that we need to do in Italy as white practitioners, also to understand how, in my case, for example, whiteness and masculinity allowed me to join to certain institutional spaces, and also never allowed me to question about the knowledge production that I was absorbing in my my upbringing as a practitioner and as a researcher and as a curator. So I would say that for me, the very strong political awakening about this dynamics was the invitation as a curator of the Rome Quadriennale that you mentioned before, because actually I was invited to curate a section of this very important institutional event that takes place in Italy since 1934. It was actually founded under the fascist regime, and it was founded actually as an institutional platform that was aiming at presenting the best Italian art. So I would say that here we can pretty much see how the contingencies are striking, because it has been founded 2 years before the abusive occupation of Ethiopia. Well, 1 year before, and actually 2 years before the declaration of the empire, and how actually the use of art and culture to rework Italianness was pretty much there in the aim of the institution. So when I was invited in 2016 as a curator to present the best Italian art, I asked myself in a fascist building, which is also a very important point to address. And I think we will come back to this later. My fundamental question is how white practitioners actually in Italy address this topic of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism. So for me, it was a sort of ouverture that we needed to do as a group of white Italian practitioners dealing with documentarism and documentary practices to rethink ourselves in a way, and effectively rethink ourselves in our relationship to education, amnesic policies, and also this absence of critical whiteness actually work in Italy. So, and this actually, for me, was the beginning of a journey, which is a journey of training and self-training among different platforms. That's why I was also pointing out that I'm very happy to be in company of actually partners and alliances that actually allow me to do this work in network.
Thank you, Simone.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. Theo, can you please share more about your work? And do you think that artists, activists, and scholars are reimagining the archives in Italy?
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. In my case, I've been engaging with the notion of the archive on two different levels. So my relationship to the images and my relationship with the digital media, the social media, and I've been in my series, my project, which can be placed within the strain of the internet art. I've been trying to resignify and sampling and also sharing visualities that we are all familiar with. And what I'm doing in my project is that I'm juxtaposing canonical European paintings with images hailing from the Black diaspora. And in this visual encounter, I try to reimagine how the notion of Blackness is defined. And in this juxtaposition, I try to offer new readings to the image. And we know that with the reproduction of a painting, new images are constructed, and these meanings, however, most of the time silent, goes unheard. And so by juxtaposing these images that are different on a superficial level, I try to express this new paradigms that we can engage with in studying the images.
Thank you so much, Theophilus. Yes, one of the poster image is also one of the images that you put in Echoes and Agreements, or Ecce Accordi. Angelica, can you share our next question?
Sure. I think actually already has been mentioned in this first round of questions, but I really would like, because this is so important and crucial in what we do, right? Our position in this debate. So where do we start from? And so I just wanted to ask you individually, actually, how does your positionality shape the knowledge you produce from your own perspective? I know it's a tough question, but I think is really at the core of this debate, something that Simone a bit mentioned, and we will touch upon again. But position and positionality. Justin, can we start from you?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a complex one, always. I think, honestly, it brings me back to the first question a little bit, in that I think that one of the things in the distinction that I was trying to make between acknowledging and centering is definitely a question of positionality, right? So Black artists, Black curators, Black activists don't really have difficulty centering the Black experience. It sort of just is, right? And so really when we talk about positionality in relation to institutions and other sites, in a certain sense, there's an effort that needs to be made, right? But I think that honestly, positionality is something in regards to institutions that a lot of times is a bit of a gatekeeper. In my own work, in my own sort of critical analysis of the frame, my own positionality as an African-American who has relocated to Italy, based on a really sort of, in the context of higher education in the United States, a very classic study abroad experience, right? Those are the things that really brought me into this space. And they're the things that sort of grounded my reflections initially in the context of Italy. I think that my own relationship to thinking about Italy within my own family heritage, and in that my father's mother was an Italian orphan, it is always sort of sitting somewhere in my mind and relate when I'm having conversations about what it means to exist in the Italian context, how many different ways we can think about in relation to sort of Blackness in this space, and who gets included in that discussion, who's excluded. But then I'm also very conscious of the ways in which, Black History Month Florence, all of our work is framed in part by a very U.S. centered mentality, right? So that's a mentality that I brought with me to this place. It's some of what drove me to want to do some of the work that I'm doing. And so I'm always very conscious of the ways in which, the U.S. frame of Blackness is one that a lot of times can be a little bit myopic in terms of understanding the range of Blacknesses that exist in the world, and sometimes also wanting to, and I don't know if it's a desire or if it's just sort of an outgrowth of a lot of times the way in which we talk about and engage in geography from the standpoint of the United States, this sort of, centering of the US experience as the experience or as universal somehow. It's definitely something that I'm conscious of and aware of, and that I've engaged in a lot of work in really expanding upon. I think that the project that we did, Fischi per Fiaschi, which is designed specifically to invite audiences informally to engage in conversations that are about positionality, to really think about what it means to sort of center ourselves in order to then have a real conversation. And I think that that's something that too often is left outside of the room when we're engaging with institutions. There's a lot of times an incapacity to sort of see themselves and to understand what they represent, and to understand the ways in which what they represent is incongruous with a lot of the things that they say they stand for. And so these are the complications, I think, in externalizing those. And a lot of times when we push to externalize people's positionalities, it is met by resistance. A lot of people don't really want to engage in thinking about positionality, because engaging in any form of positionality is engaging in self-criticality, right? It's
of course.
Awareness. It's an awareness of our ignorances. It's awareness of all of that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. Thank you so much. And you said something that really struck me, right? When you were wondering, what does it mean to exist in a certain space? And so for all of us here, we can think about Italy. What does it mean to exist in Italian culture, in Italian history? Think about, right, our presence in, for example, in colonialism, where are our experiences located? Many of these are missing. And so it's also a matter of wondering where we are and sometimes writing a history that has not been written yet. Benjamina, your positionality, what do you in relation to the knowledge you produce?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I think that is perhaps one of the most important questions when operating, from my standpoint, within the space of a museum. And it's in terms of the relation to the sources I study, I deal with. I think my African background puts me sometimes in a very difficult position, because you are confronting sources that, did not even consider you human at the time of their production. And so it's a very painful experience when you are dealing with history and dealing with the material evidence of history. That also, when you are operating within an institution like a museum that was set up within a colonial context, it translates into what becomes the sort of the official knowledge that we hold about the objects that you present to the world. And that official knowledge is oftentimes produced by people who did not situate themselves within the cultures they are talking about and they are presenting to the world. And so for me, my position as a Black African person who comes from an immigrant background, so my parents migrated to Italy in the 80s, and that very much informed my upbringing. And so even the range of career options that I could aspire to. So, my position is actually quite an anomaly in terms of I'm an outlier, right? In terms of, what I study, in terms of where I sit. And so that anomaly becomes being the only person in the room, right? So the only Black person in the room. Within my team, within my museum, I'm the only Black person. And that is a very difficult spot to be in, because whilst you can speak for your culture, though that culture you're speaking of is filtered through the diasporan experience, right? You are not necessarily able to speak for the whole African continent. Yet there is this expectation that somehow you are able to. And so I think recognizing where you sit is actually important, not just for the people who are asking of you, but is also for you to understand what you are able to offer in terms of your knowledge base, in terms of the sensitivities that you are able to access. And so that's a lot of the work I've been doing in terms of, how I situate myself in the work I do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Benjamina. And your words really resonated a lot to me, especially when you were talking, in terms of painful experiences, discovering certain knowledge, but also being the only Black body in a room, in a sector, in an industry sometimes. So definitely this I am an anomaly, I think, is a very powerful way to put it. Simone, you mentioned something already in your first response, when we were asking you how are curators recentering, and you specify actually that maybe in Italy would be a case of saying how are white Italian curators, practitioners addressing these issues we are discussing. And so here you are representing a bit a certain category. And so what about your positionality as a white male Italian in this debate?
Yeah, as you can imagine, positionality and criticality is a crucial point also in the work that we do in the arts, also because the Italian art scene is predominantly white, especially in spaces of power and spaces of decision making. So I think that what I'm saying, it's kind of resonating also with what Benjamin and Justin were saying before, actually. And I would say that some work has been done, but a lot of work has been done, but has been done on a sort of thematical level. So in recent years, like recent 5 years, a lot of questions about colonialism, structural racism, and also the absence actually of certain epistemologies of experiences or art productions actually in the collections or in the exhibitions of Italian institutions have been addressed. But this has been also a sort of starting point that have systematically covered the structural dimension of this absence, and which is actually related to the fact that institutions in Italy reproduce certain habits related to sexism and racism. So these absences are not just because of absence of the practitioners, which is also the common narrative that goes around. We don't have Black practitioners in Italy, but it's because of a sort of incapacity of opening up the institutional space to the entire thing, the whole experience that inhabits a space like Italy. So I would say that the work that we need to do right now as white practitioners working in the institution is a work that has to do with accuracy and no more about thematic work. It's a work that needs to reform institutionally and structurally the way in which we work. And also I would go back on this point because the history of racism in Italy is also a history of erasure of aesthetics, erasure of experiences, way of inhabiting the world. So there is a sort of aesthetic governance in a visual arts institution, in museums institution that actually prevent the access of certain kind of practices in the institutional space. So, or frame the access in a certain ethnographical mode of being present. So I go back to the name of the project of Black History Month. So you are present only as an ethnographable object. So it's very dangerous perspective. We will talk about, stolen objects later on in this talk, but I would say that curatorial work in Italy often reproduce this ethnographic gaze on Black practitioners and BPOC practitioners living and working in Italy. Mm-hmm. So I would say that the critical work on positionality needs to be done because it engages a lot of other territories in which we need to work a lot.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Can I just add?
Sure.
When I mentioned, so when he was talking about so Black presence being situated in a specific context, I think it also comes from the fact that there is actually a failure of imagination. Like within the Italian context, there is incapacity to imagine that a Black person can occupy a certain space, right? And so, for example, you will see in galleries and in museums, the Black presence is the janitorial staff or the sort of the staff that takes care of the space, right? Mm-hmm. Cleaning and putting things away, or security. But actually you don't see Black presence when it comes to the sort of the curatorial staff, or the sort of the staff that deals with the sort of the prestigious side of that space, and therefore you can. And this happened to me at a museum conference. You can be in a space and you can be rightfully occupying that space, yet be considered as not belonging, and therefore you must be the cleaner, or you must be, not the part of the curatorial staff. And so it's part of this wider issue that we have in Italy, the failure to imagine what might be possible. And again, that links to our inability to, deconstruct the whole racism situation.
Absolutely. And I think it's connected to what we have been saying so far, right? The erasure of certain experiences also, in a way, prevent you from imagining certain things, right? You don't even think this is conceivable. And so sometimes, as you were saying, not only be extremely visible, but sometimes even being invisible. Even if you are there, you don't exist, right? Theo, what are your perspectives on this question, your positionality, and related to the knowledge you produce on the social media, for example? Your Instagram channel is well visited. So what do you think about that?
So in my case, my practice reflects my experience as being a diasporic subject, born and raised in Italy. So that's why I chose the medium of the diptych, because in the diptych there is this notion of the double that is inherent to the image, and this notion of doubleness is what informs my experience and my quotidian life. I always like to quote Lorraine O'Grady, who created the series Miscegenated Family Album. It's a series of 16 diptychs where she put family photos with images of Nefertiti. And in explaining the series, she was saying that she noticed that diasporic subjects tend to use the diptych to explain this in-betweenness of the daily life, this being both and. And so this, for me, this notion of both and is the same. That's the reason why I chose to specifically represent the African experience, the Black experience, and the European experience. And in doing so, what I'm trying to convey is this idea that the Black body and the Black image is worthy to be studied and considered as we study the canonical images that hangs on European Museum.
Thank you, Theo. Candice, la parola a te.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for those reflections, Theo, Simone, Benjamin, Justin. What really resonated with me and what you all shared is that, just starting with what you shared, Justin, how for Black folk centering the experience can come regularly, whereas then when you have the positionality, like you were sharing, Simone and Benjamina, of white practitioners and curators, there's this need to just really address the imagining and really address that failure of imagining. So I really just appreciated learning your reflections. And one thing that I was wondering as you were speaking is if you could just then share more about how material culture in Italy is curated and managed. Especially your reflections on positionality that really left me wondering, how is material culture curated and managed in Italy? And if you could also speak to then how this process is related to a history of colonialism, which was also a central point in the answers that you shared previously. And Simone, maybe if you could start.
Right. It's a very tough question, I would say, right now, also because we are witnessing a constant series of, I don't know how to define them, but like I would say goofy experiments in anthropological and ethnographical museums right now in Italy. There is a common friend who has actually been inquiring a lot the role of anthropological and ethnographical museums, which are actually preserving, let's say, material culture related to Italian colonial experience in their collections, and that are right now declaring to a sort of will to decolonize themselves as institutional body and decolonize also their collection, which is, if you want, a sort of paradoxical experience, because this decolonization of the anthropological museum would correspond, in my understanding, only to a sort of suicide, mainly because these collections are inherently how they've been created, but also how they've been preserved and how they've been researched over the last 15 years, reproducing histories of violence on a material, but also on a symbolic level. So I'm not saying that there is no repair and no reparation or compensation possible, but actually the epistemological basis on which this desire of decolonize the museum, or desire of being a political agent in the collection, or to, I would say, perform certain political credential in declaring to want to decolonize, need to be reformed in deep. So, and it goes back to the question of positionality. It goes back to the question of doing a genealogical work on our institution and understanding where the ideological framing of that institution have been set, and how aesthetics, programs, and also decision-making has been managed over the last 15 years. It is currently managed. So I'm pointing out something which is mainly related to tokenism and also appropriation under the label of post-colonial action, under the label of decolonial, where actually you have a bunch of Black Italian practitioners that are invited to do consultations in the institutions, but actually are not allowed to really touch at the institution as it is. I don't want to be so specific, but just to reconstruct more general dynamics, which is also related to the fact that this ethnographical gaze towards certain subjectivities, certain practices, and certain aesthetics still remain in place, also in contemporary curating, and how we lack actually a sort of courage of going in deep into self-criticality. Like, that's why I was bringing up the idea of generative suicide for this institution, which is also a discourse was going on in Italy around museums and how fascist sign and colonial traces in our cities, in our naming, in our laws, and how we frame certain subjects. So I think there is a lack of courage, I would say, and also a lack of imagination, as Benjamina was saying, because it's no more time for allowing entrance or giving space, but like renouncing to certain spaces, I would say, in institutions, because time is over for white guilt, I would say, and also time is over for post-colonial rhetorics. Sorry, I just needed to say this.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you for sharing that answer. And I really actually appreciated at the beginning when you had described it as an experiment, because it left me wondering in your statement about experiments and describing just how, at least on an institutional level, the approach to that institutions are taking to address Blackness at times can be viewed as an experiment. And left me wondering, well, whose experiment are we? We, as in a broad sense, like folks of the African diaspora. So I think just that language that you shared there was really helpful. And then also the question that you shared about repair and reparation and that relationship with epistemology is really important. That's, I feel like, a few steps later down the road, maybe another conversation, but I think, is that possible? How can that be imagined with repair and reparations, and how knowledge is produced and centered, considering the violence that has taken place, that continues to exist today? Justin, can you just share more about how Italy's material culture is curated and managed, and how this process is related to a history of colonialism, especially expanding on what Simone just shared?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it is yet another complex question. I think that, what Simone was referring to when he talked about this sort of thematic level, which I would also say is sort of a project-oriented level, this imagining that a project sort of can position an institution as actually on the right side of history, or as having done something, really meaningful. I think that those are considerations that are extremely problematic because, of course, like the notion of tokenism actually pops up. And what happens is that tokenism, it becomes so prevalent in these forms, the sort of lack of continuity beyond a project, beyond a dialogue that's held, that anytime someone talks about what it means to sort of really look critically at a collection or a series of objects, the notion of rewriting history sort of comes up quickly, because they see it as yet another, they see us as doing the same thing that's happening in the space when a token is brought forward, right? So when a more profound conversation is brought to the surface and we say, we're interested in having a long-standing conversation about what this space represents, what these objects represent, that notion of the sort of quick project makes it really easy to sort of dismiss what's actually happening when we try to engage more profoundly. But I think that, and I would extend also what Benjamina was saying in relation to a failure of imagination. I think it's actually more connected to what happens when mass media and social media are the research methodologies. And that's way too frequently the case when it comes to really engaging in a conversation with institutions that have extensive collections that that they're not actually really caring for in the full narration of what those things represent. A lot of that lack of vision is rooted in the fact that they have not taken the time to inform themselves in any way beyond a headline that they read that they said, yeah, we should do this too. Right. And so, I mean, those things are incredibly problematic. But I think that really, when you're talking about how the material culture is managed, we have to think about gatekeepers of knowledge. Right. And I think that we have to think, when we talk about colonial history, we have to also talk about kind of like colonial histories and the ways in which the colonial histories of antiquity tend to be, they underwrite almost everything from an institutional standpoint in the context of Italy. So, when we go back and look at the colonial histories of the Roman Empire, it becomes that much more difficult to detether this from all of the systems that are actually underpinning what we're doing and what we're talking about, what we're accepting as knowledge, the word classical, the way that it's used, all of these traditions and the ways in which they're understood in the context are actually rooted in that moment as well. So that when we talk about colonial history in a more modern period, I think it's really important not to sort of separate that so much from a continuation, right? And it's clear also, I think, in a sort of a fascist grappling with wanting to reclaim something. The question that I have is, was that something ever gone? Really, right? Or was that just consistent? Was it carried forth and just sort of not questioned? Because I think those are things that dive us into a understanding of values that are really important. And I think that that's what brings us to a point where it's also, I've experienced in one conference in particular where people who were seriously interested in expanding their knowledge, moving beyond the sort of academic discourse into a realm of interface with people that maybe don't exist within that academic realm. And what happened was that one activist was talking about the fact that if there was anything that they wanted people to go away with at the end of this discussion, it was that we too are capable of knowledge production, which seems like a very basic statement, but there was actually a hand that went up quickly, and someone said, what kind of knowledge production are you capable of? Could you give us examples? And they were really there ready to take notes. But this tells us like how difficult it is sometimes to really the positionality in relation to that, but then also what the sort of honest seeking of an ability to enter into the discourse, how that can actually already be sidetracked by a lack of investment in any sort of research or reflection.
Thank you, Justin. And carry on with this question, right? The management of material culture and the relationship with the history of colonialism. What about Europe? Beyond Italy, what are other European countries doing? Benjamina, maybe we can start from you because you are based in the UK. So what's happening there? What is the relationship between these two aspects, managing culture and acknowledging or reckoning with colonialism?
Yeah, thank you. So before I answer that, I just quickly want to address something Simone said about this attempt to create a post-colonial narrative, but actually by institutions. And yes, I will add to that quite frankly, you cannot create a post-colonial structure when you haven't dealt with the colonial structure. And like Simone rightfully said, that is embedded in everything in Italy. I mean, the laws, the physical landscape. I mean, there are fascist monuments sitting on the Italian soil, and it's, they are monuments that are well regarded. And so the idea that perhaps the cultural institution, like physical buildings, museums, somehow sit outside of, of the society at large is fantastical. And so in terms of how that relates to the curation of material culture, how that is related to the past, the history, it sits right next to it. It is that colonial past. It's actually a site of colonial violence and a site of colonial celebration through public monuments. So that's my thought on that. In terms of, I guess, what can be done about it, and examples of what other institutions, like institutions here in the UK, are doing. So there's a lot of collaboration happening, and whilst it's also problematic because Justin mentioned how situating sort of repairing damage through projects it's limiting because you cannot deconstruct 400 years of history through a 1-year project or a couple of years project. So it is heavily problematic, but I think what we can take out of that is the willingness to acknowledge the damage that has been done, the willingness to acknowledge that the knowledge about the material culture of African people in the case that I deal with, the knowledge we have is heavily influenced by racism and white supremacy. I think that is important. Acknowledging that is important. There are institutions, for example, the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, at the University of Glasgow. They recently appointed a curator of discomfort. That's literally the title. And I think that is so powerful. And, the job of this curator is not actually with the object. Her job is not with the object. Her job is actually to understand the positionality of the staff that cares for these objects, to understand how and what the sort of the identities that they bring with them, how that influences their output and the work that they transfer onto the knowledge production. There are other museums like my museum, the institution I work for, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. We do collaborations with source communities. We recently finished a project called Rethinking Relationships, where we actually, so when we talk about whose knowledge is sort of their knowledge, right? We were working with East African researchers, and that knowledge that was produced during the project now sits within the catalog, and that is the knowledge about the objects that we care for. These are just examples of some of the ways conversations can be initiated. Certainly the space of a project is not enough, but it's a start.
Sure. When you were talking, Benjamin, I was imagining a similar position in Italy, curator of discomfort in any Italian museum. What would be the outcome? That would be really, really interesting to see. And also what you were saying about the buildings, that I think is such a problem in a way in Italy. And when you were talking, I was thinking about an article that our colleague Ruth Ben-Ghiat has published in 2017, where she was asking, why are there so many fascist monuments still standing in Italy, right? And if you read the article, she doesn't ask in any way to knock down buildings. She was actually problematizing. And I remember the hostility by many Italian scholars when reading that article, thinking, how dare she to talk about our art, our patrimonio, like if art is something sacred and untouchable, and not even putting a sign around the monument would be kind of disfiguring this art. So also the specific idea of art present in Italy. And so this, as Simone was saying, this lack of epistemologies that really prevent us from problematize and seeing the complexities and the nuances of this issue. And Simone, I don't know if you have any example from European perspectives, and you are based in France, so I don't know if you have an example from your side.
Concerning France, there is a big issue going on about restitutions of certain objects from Benin, and actually, there is a big project about the restitution of these objects, but actually. Also, the simple acts of giving the objects back is not enough if it's not framed into a certain, as Benjamin was saying, you cannot actually recover from a violent history of hundreds of years with just one gesture. And also, what does it mean to bring certain kind of objects out of the museum and give them back to a country that maybe doesn't know what to do with them because of the sort of lack of context, preparation of the context about this, giving back an object that has itself an history of expropriation. And so I would say that as the President Macron put it at the beginning of the project, it was just a mode of empowering France in its neo-colonial sort of action. That's why I'm saying without even preparing the return of the objects, because it was the aim of the act was just to giving them back. So, and after the borders, we don't really care what it's going to be for these subjects anymore. So, and this brings me also to say that there is something which is very worrying about also politics of visibility, and also this that passes through tokenism. For example, the Museum of Quai de Branly in Paris has been engaging a lot into contemporary art projects, where actually tries to, in a way, enlarge the spectrum, the institutional spectrum of the arts and also practitioner working in the museum. But there is something which is very dangerous, I would say, behind this tokenist politics of visibility, which is actually the overshading of the community behind the token, which is what Benjamina was saying, like allowing institutions to think that actually opening the access to certain tokens is enough to do a deconstruction, to decolonize the institution, and actually deconnecting completely the token, which is used, vampirized through this action, from the community which is behind them, and who's actually producing knowledge, producing resistance, producing inertia as well, relating to the knowledge which is produced, and which is also maybe not recognized by certain communities. So there is something which is very 90s in this politics, and that's why I was bringing out the notion of accuracy. It's no more time of putting out projects without being accurate in terms of epistemology, methodology, and also thinking about the consequences of this sort of imposed reparations as well, because we're talking also about this.
Sure.
Imposing reparations on certain communities, which maybe are not asking for that.
Mm-hmm. So, and actually what you were mentioning, the vampirism, right, in relation to this topic, I think is extremely powerful. Justin, any European experiences from your perspectives in relation to culture management and acknowledge colonialism and the history of colonialism?
I think there's a number of different institutions that I've been in dialogue with that I sort of look to and follow, and that's institutions that are like formal institutions and informal institutions. There's groups and collectives that are doing some really incredible work in terms of really trying to shift the narration. One experience that I had was in dialogue with Emmanuel Nsunda, who has created a number of projects. One of them is called Afrofeminism in Progress. And one of the things that she talked about that I thought was particularly relevant and meaningful connects to also what Simone was just saying. And she was talking about the fact that in most cases, museums and institutions that have material culture are not really very interested in the function of that material culture. They're more interested in the aesthetics of it. And what happens when you stop to care for the function or the spiritual life of an object, right? And the ways in which also we sort of can dictate through that, whether or not something's actually been cared for, right? And so also the conversation of the appropriate museum structure being set in place in order to conserve the objects exactly as they are now, it's a really big question. I like to look to the short story by Alice Walker, Everyday Use, because I think it gives us a really great example for thinking about different forms of value in relation to use and what it means to sort of conserve something by putting it on a wall or in a display case, and what it means to conserve something by actually putting it to everyday use, making it a part of our daily existence. And I think that that's something that is very underappreciated in the context of art in general. And it's actually connected also to our understanding of monuments today. When we fail to appreciate monuments as a site for potential action, for potential dialogue, for all the things that I think a lot of people who argue against the removal of monuments by saying that they're sites for learning. I think that, the fact that these are not sites that get used in that way is maybe something we should talk about, right? So maybe we should start using monuments as a site for activation, for dialogue, right? And then we can sort of have that argument. But I think that, again, the use, right? When these things exist as sort of aesthetics, as formal considerations, we take away a lot of, we unsee the power that they actually hold. right? And I think that that's something that's extremely important to think about. And I think, in our experience of working with the YGBI research residency has been an incredible platform of exchange, so that we've been able to bring sort of young artists based in Italy together with thinkers from other contexts. So we worked with Andrea Fatona, who's at OCAD in Canada, to think about diaspora from her point of view in dialogue with a group of artists that are based here in Italy. And I think that's these kinds of conversations are really rich because they unveil a lot of the reflections that are centered in different spaces. The second edition is right now in dialogue with Arlette Louise Ndekose, who's in Savi Contemporary. And she's bringing a whole other perspective. I think that Savi Contemporary is certainly one of the institutions that I would mention that I look to sort of as a guiding light, as a reflection that provides a really interesting critical stance, a really interesting space for exchange and a different understanding of values. And so bringing that perspective in touch with artists, young artists, in forms of formation that are happening right now, I think is a really important way to sort of also in expanding for all the reflection on what can be done. First off, it's about sort of coming in contact with other ways of doing things. I think that that's particularly important.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you so much for sharing that. And hearing your responses and conversation just with Benjamina and Simone's, it really just also left me wondering, so then how can this systemic violence that we see within the field of art curation be deconstructed? You had shared just some examples of institutions that you look to, but would just like to sit a bit longer on that question. How can systemic violence within the field of art curation be deconstructed? Are there any examples of this occurring? Theo, would love to just start with you and hear your thoughts on this.
I think as it was already mentioned, like the first step to take to deconstruct the systemic violence in the art field is to be aware of how we engage with the objects that have been naturalized within the European Museum. Ariella Zulay has written extensively on this topic, and in one of her essays, she says that we must study these objects not as discrete objects, so not as objects separated from the communities where they were part of, because in doing so we are caught in the imperial taxonomy, and we exercise the imperial rules that were perpetrated against the people that rejected them, and also like in studying and engaging with photographs, sometimes like scholars make the mistake of proving the modernity of photographed people in the context of images that are cataloged as tribal. And sometimes we want to prove the modernity of the photograph subject. But Ariella Zulay in that essay warns us that even imposing this category of modernity, like imposing this idea of modernity, is also part of the imperial rule. And so we have to be very aware in how we engage with both photographs and artifacts that are in the museum.
Thank you for sharing that response, Theo. It definitely left me thinking just about the questions that we shared, or the reflections we had about knowledge production and positionality in relation to that. Benjamina, can you share more about how systemic violence within the field of art curation can be deconstructed? And in your reflections, can you just share any examples of this occurring?
Yeah, sure. So acknowledgement is, I think, like Theophilus said, is really important because that actually informs the way we move forward. Earlier, Justin mentioned gatekeeping of knowledge, and I think that is so important. The people that actually curate the knowledge may sometimes actually perpetrate this violence because of the way in which objects are talked about, people are talked about, and how objects are used to assert certain narratives. And so I think one of the ways we can do this work is actually to bring in people that can contribute to that knowledge, and not just through projects and residencies and things like that, which are great, but they do not address the core of the issue. They sort of shine the surface, but once the project is done, in a year's time there will still be dust on that surface. I think permanent positions that are actually committed to learning and to engaging with communities and people are very important. And when it comes, for example, to communities, I'm always very mindful of exploitation. Are we bringing communities in to extract their knowledge? Give them like a £100 fee, and then never to be seen or spoken to again, and use that knowledge as evidence of deconstructing violence. And so I think if we are committed to deconstructing violence, we actually have to invest in that commitment. And there's no greater investment than to actually establish spaces where this work can be done. So that's one part.
Thank you, Benjamina. Hearing your answers, and just throughout this webinar, I'm thinking just about how all of this is really just a process, right? There's no one-stop shop to addressing the questions that we are sharing. And there are so many layers. The imperial taxonomy that Theo was talking about is directly correlated to what you were sharing about the extractive relationship that can occur when trying to just even acknowledge the work that communities do, and being really aware of how curators engage with the communities that they are working with and building relationships. Simone, can you share more about how systemic violence within the field of art curation can be deconstructed? Any examples of this occurring? Feel free to also just add on what Benjamina and Theo have already reflected on.
Yes, I would add something also, bringing an example that actually keeps running into my head since the beginning, because I remember being at the presentation of the book of Françoise Vergès, Decolonial Feminism, 3 years ago, and it was a full audience. And I remember at a certain point from the audience, a white woman raises her hand and says, "How can we white feminists be in solidarity with you?" And Françoise answered, "Educate yourself." And I would say that education is the way, but not education intended as an institutional practice, but more this practice of self-education is really important, especially for us white folks, I would say, engaging with certain questions. Also because very often critical positions are produces spaces of banality and are used for creating self-recognition. So they're actually doing the opposite of what they should do. So I would say that, relating also to what Justin was saying before, a long-term commitment is a form of self-education from both, for all the people involved in this movement that asks for reforms, institutional reforms and there is also something that it's pretty much there was a very strong light also in my self-education work. And it's this book, Curating as an Anti-Racist Practice, which has been edited in 2017 by a group of brilliant curators and artists, Natalie Bayer, Belinda Kaczynski, who's also very close to some of us, and Nora Sternfeld. And there is a part of the book where they say that talking about anti-racist curating is almost paradoxical, because curating in itself should be conceived as an anti-racist practice, because it's about deconstructing the idea of objectivity. So curating is also about manipulating objects' powers and creating narratives. And through creation of new narratives, there is a sort of deconstruction of objectivity, which is at the core of creations of canons, as we were saying before, and also practices of inclusions and exclusions. So, this book has been mind-blowing for me, because it opened up a lot of questions about also what we were saying before, like the history of curating from anthropological museum till contemporary art practices, how actually the essence of to be formed in itself. And so how the work is profound, as Benjamina was saying. So it starts with acknowledgement, but it has to go into structures at a certain point. So I would say this.
Thank you so much, Simone. Thank you for those reflections and that resource as well. Justin, in the last few minutes that we have, can you just please share your final reflections?
Yeah, I think this has been a really extremely rich conversation, and of course, it hits home on so many levels. These are things that I actually think part of my own research, part of my own engagement, is to have this kind of conversation with people. I love engaging in this, but I think that when we were talking about this sort of need for space, I cited Savvy as an example, and I've been looking, of course, over the years to other sites across Europe who are engaging in this kind of critical work as a way of really examining different models, different strategies, different approaches. And we actually started a project in 2019 that has grown out of the need for a space, for a center. Originally, it was really a need for a space and a center. And then it sort of became more about the interest in sort of occupying space. And so the project is called the Recovery Plan. And it is, in essence, a Black cultural center. But what it actually represents is a capacity to sort of do all of the different things which we had been doing for years inside of different institutions on our own terms. So without needing to sort of go through and ask, without needing to sort of lean on what is a lot of times understood as the sort of benevolence of institutions, right? And really inviting ourselves in. And I think that this has grown into something now that we're in the process this year of establishing a space in Florence that will be dedicated to this work. And it's one that I think brings all the people in this conversation into dialogue. And it's one that I hope will provide one of these spaces that may, I'm hoping that we can share strategies, share approaches, share reflections, and at the same time be collectors of these things as well. I really think that the nature of a space like this is to be able to really provide access to things, but then also to sort of be a space where we can actually really engage in this kind of conversation on the daily in practice of event making, but also just as a living room, right? Just as a space where we can go when we want to and engage in this kind of conversation without needing an audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. So we are at the end of this phenomenal conversation. I have to say, this was really, really interesting. And I'm sure our audience will definitely enjoy this too, because we could have carried on another 2 hours. I think there was so much. Thank you so much, Justin, Simone, Theo, and Benjamina. Thank you. And thank you, Candice, for co-hosting this episode.